let's start maybe by talking about what is Zionism and how this movement came to be and its history. There is a lot of tendency to speak about Zionism in very broad generalizations, both from supporters and detractors of the movement. This tends to create the false image as if Zionism is a kind of monolithic movement with a very clear, defined ideology, when in fact there are many branches within Zionism, and there have always been many branches within Zionism. There has never been one dominant group of Zionists which determined how the movement should act and what should its goals be. So let's talk about the origins of Zionism. It starts in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and it starts in several areas, but of course it's mostly associated with Theodor Herzl, a journalist from Austria, also from France, and he observed the trial of Dreyfus, the Jewish officer in the French army who was accused falsely of treason. And part of the reason that he was accused and convicted, although eventually he was exonerated, was the fact that he was Jewish, and there was a racist sentiment towards Jews. Theodor Herzl, also a Jew, saw this trial as a sign that Zionism, that Jews cannot really integrate into European society. And therefore, he started the Zionist movement with the idea that Jews should emigrate and leave Europe. Of course, we have to remind ourselves that not all of the Jews lived in Europe at the time. But the largest Jewish community in the world was indeed in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, but there were certainly also Jews living in Central Europe and Western Europe. Now, Herzl actually adopted into the Zionist movement three very basic tenets, which were actually tenets already existing with anti-Semitic movements, with racist movements towards Jews. And these three tenets are, first, Jews are different from all other people. It's not just one extra religion or one extra ethnic group, like the many different religions and ethnic groups that already live in Europe and in other places in the world. No, Jews are somehow different. Second, that there is an inherent reason that Jews cannot coexist with other people. While it's normal to think that in France you can have, or in Germany you can have Protestants and Catholics living together, and you can have people of different ethnicities and so on, but the racism towards Jews is somehow incurable, something that both the racists, the anti-Semites, and the Zionists are saying. And third, the solution to this problem is that the Jews have to leave and find themselves somewhere else to be. Obviously, the vast majority of Jews rejected Herzl's ideas, and they rejected the idea of Zionism because they said, of course, we don't accept any one of these 3 points. We consider ourselves to be Europeans, to be Poles and Germans and French of a different religion. But that doesn't mean that we have given up our rights to be equal citizens. And if you look at other kind of movements that arise around the world during that time and also later against racism, against discrimination, Zionism sort of stands out somewhat different than those movements because of the conclusion, because it's not a movement for equal rights, it's a movement for emigration. But I say that it stands out, but it's actually not unique. And that's a very important point to make, because the idea that people who suffer from persecution will leave their country and look for somewhere else to live is an idea that has already been a major element of the European colonial movement and the colonial history of Europe, which means, for example, if you look at the history of the United States and Canada, these are countries that were formed, and also Australia, of course, New Zealand, and South Africa. These are countries that were formed by Europeans leaving their homes in Europe not because they were strong and rich and they wanted to conquer the world, but actually because they were weak and poor and persecuted for their religion or for other reasons. And they felt that they don't have a chance to live the life they want to live in Europe. And so they moved to areas where the local population was even weaker than they were, whether it's North America or Australia or South Africa, and established in those areas they attempted to establish a kind of utopia or a kind of life that they would want to have in Europe. So, for example, people who had no land in Europe could actually afford to buy some land in the colonies and to become landowners, and that was their dream. So when Jews adopted Zionism, from the very beginning, they adopted the language of the colonial movement, they adopted the policies of the colonial movement, and just like any other colonial movement, they realized they're not going to be able to do it just individually going and conquering some part of the world, but it has to be with the protection and the support of major European powers. So Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, writes a letter to one of the most important leaders of the colonial movement, the European colonial movement, Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is one of the few people in the world who had a country named after him, Rhodesia. Of course, there is no Rhodesia anymore because it was an apartheid state, and when it became no longer an apartheid state, they changed the name. Cecil Rhodes was a man who dedicated his life to carving Africa into small pieces and establishing European colonies, mainly for the British Empire. So Herzl wrote to him, "I want your advice and your assistance in allowing for the immigration of Jews into Palestine, which is essentially a colonial project." Herzl had no problem to use that word. Now that I said that, you will say, well, Zionism is a colonial movement, and as such, it is immoral, and Palestinians have every right to reject it. But you have to remember that everything has to be put in the right historical context. In the 19th century, to say that something is colonial or someone is a colonialist or a colonist was not in any way pejorative. That was normal in the European political culture of the time. So there is nothing especially evil or cruel about people who express the ideas of their time, even if their actions are certainly evil and cruel to our eyes today, because they are expropriating the lands of the natives and kicking out the original owners and so on. But what we have to understand is that the Zionist movement did not just freeze in time. The Zionist movement did not stay the movement of Theodor Herzl and stop there. It continued to evolve and continued to change the discourse. So a very crucial moment in the history of the Zionist movement is the year 1941. And this is based on a very important article by Hannah Arendt. That in the year 1941, there was actually a summit meeting in the Biltmore Hotel in New York of the leaders of various factions of the Zionist movement. Back then, already in 1941, there's already a large colony, a Jewish colony in the country of Palestine, country but not state, because Palestine was a British protectorate under British rule, with between 200 and 300,000 Jews already living there in that time. 1941, the Second World War is raging. The final solution for the so-called final solution, the extermination or the attempt to exterminate the Jews by the Nazi Germany has already begun. And the Zionist movements have to decide what are their plans. Not that they have the ability to stop the Nazi army, but one major goal of Zionism was to create a safe haven for Jews, so a place for them to escape from persecution. And never in the history of Judaism has there been so much persecution against Jews as in 1941. This was a very crucial moment. At that time, if we talk about the Zionist movement, it's a very fractured movement. There are the religious Zionists, which I think is a very interesting branch of Zionism, which because in the Jewish religion, the idea of colonizing the Holy Land is considered blasphemy, at least in Orthodox Jewish tradition. You have to wait for the Messiah to come before you return to the Holy Land, because the exile from the Holy Land is explained within the Jewish theology as punishment from God. So how can people just decide they don't want to be punished anymore? This is an act of blasphemy. And the Jewish and the Zionist religious Zionism, they have a different interpretation. They have an interpretation that the Messiah is not necessarily an individual. The Messiah can be a movement, and the Zionist movement itself is messianic. It is itself the beginning of redemption and overcoming this punishment by God by returning to the Holy Land and building something to glorify God and Judaism. So this is a very interesting branch, but in 1941 this is a small minority within the Zionist movement. There is also the National Zionism, which is much more similar to colonial movements of the British Empire and the French Empire, saying we are, as Jews, not just a religion, but we are first and foremost a nation, and as a nation we deserve to have our land, our country. This was the kind of nationalism you saw in other countries like Germany and Poland, but those were not colonial powers at the time. And so the interpretation of the National Zionists was Palestine belongs to us. But if we cannot have good religious reasons to justify how that Palestine belongs to us, we will conquer it with our blood, and we will and it will belong to us by our right of strength, not by our moral rights. And again, National Zionism was in 1941 a minority group, a much bigger minority group than the religious Zionism, but still not the biggest movement. The biggest part in 1941 was the Socialist Zionism. Socialist Zionism, which was led by David ben-gurion, who later became the first prime minister of Israel, was an idea of combining socialist ideology, creating a sort of just society with national Zionism. So not saying, so this is a very kind of complicated argument to say why does Palestine belong to us? Not because God promised it to us, because we don't necessarily believe in God. Not because we conquered it by force, because we don't want to say that right makes might, that might makes right. We don't want to say that we only deserve it if we kill everybody who opposes us. But it belongs to us because we want to use it in order to build a better society. And our future better society will retroactively justify all of the crimes that we have to commit now in order to conquer the land. That's Socialist Zionism, and they were the biggest branch of the Zionist movement at the time. Meeting in the Biltmore Hotel, they had to, in New York, they had to decide what they want actually to achieve. Are they going to make an appeal to the British government to give them independence in Palestine, or not to the British government, to the world community? There was no United Nations in 1941, but soon after the war there was. And in 1941, they made a very crucial decision. They said, up until now, the majority of the Zionist movement called for creation of a state for Jews. And we are now voting to change that direction. And with the majority, they have decided to ask not for a state for the Jews, but for a Jewish state. A Jewish state and a state for the Jews are not the same thing. State for the Jews, well, today we can look at the world and say, actually, the West the modern democracies that exist around the world are already, all of them, states for the Jews, in the sense that whether you live in Japan or in Canada or in South Africa, being Jewish doesn't change your legal status. There is no any kind of racism or discrimination towards you just because you're Jewish is illegal. You can be a citizen with full rights in all of these countries, regardless of if you're a Jew or not. This means a state for the Jews. So this is exactly what Herzl said cannot be achieved, and yet today it is achieved. What is a Jewish state? A Jewish state is a reversed social contract. It's not the state has been established in order to serve the people. It is how the people have to act in order to serve the state. It is almost a fascist idea, but it's not exactly a fascist idea because it's very tied to a religion which can only exist within the people. So in a way, the idea of a Jewish state is a state that will reflect Judaism more than it reflects the people who live there, the citizens, and more than it reflects its own interests as a state. So in that sense, it's not fascist. A state for itself is fascist. A state for the people is a democracy. A state for religion is a theocracy, but that's also not exactly what they meant with a Jewish state. They meant something in between, because the idea of Judaism is not understood as a religion by the Zionist movement. It's understood as something in between an ethnicity or a race, an idea which, of course, became very unpopular because of the way that it was understood by National Socialists, but also partially as a religion and partially as a nation. This is the idea of the Jewish state. This is the idea that until today becomes a very, very controversial issue that divides the Israeli public, the world community's approach towards Israel, makes it very difficult for the Israeli government to have a clear policy and a clear strategy. As we are now speaking, there is an attempt by the Israeli government to legislate a law which will define what does it mean that Israel is a Jewish state. And this law is not very easy to define because there are many different opinions about that issue. So Zionism, in many ways, has become this idea of supporting a Jewish state. But even after 1941, let's remember that this was a majority decision in the Biltmore Hotel. There always has also been a minority. And there are also Zionists today, people who define themselves as Zionists, who believe that Palestinians also have rights in Palestine, and that the idea of a Jewish state is a terrible idea, and they would much rather see a state for the Jews. And so that branch of Zionism still exists. So that is why I also do not consider myself to be an anti-Zionist. I consider myself to be not a Zionist, but I don't want to define myself against Zionism, especially that I also recognize within the Zionist movement there are also very moral people and very progressive ideas. Unfortunately, the majority of the Zionist movement today, and also the Zionist institutions, there are big institutions which are actually in practice institutions of the Israeli state and no longer institutions of a movement. I'm talking about the Jewish National Fund and about the World Zionist Organization and about the Jewish Agency. These three giant institutions which are funded by the State of Israel and promote Israeli government policy, they are associated with the Zionist movement, and they are very regressive, very colonial organizations, mainly dealing with the day-to-day necessity of what kind of actions have to be taken in order to repress Palestinian resistance, take over Palestinian land, and ensure the expansion of Israeli colonies in the Palestinian territory.